MasterCard and also the chair of the 30% Club. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you today with a fabulous panel to talk about the future of work. A piece of research has been done by Carrion and Box and the Women's Institute of Leadership at King's College, looking at what the future of work will look like, particularly in respect of what's happening with broad groups such as parents and carers. And during this online panel, we're going to go through the findings first with the help of Jenny Hill, who will be giving us a 10-minute overview. And the research actually covers thoughts from 250 different organizations about what they think the needs of their people will be in a post-pandemic world. We'd love to have your questions and your thoughts on the shifting attitudes. Before we go hear from Jenny, I'd just like to mention other people that we have on our panel here. We have Rob Cookson, who's actually VP of Real Estate Facilities for the Americas, EMEA and Asia Pacific for Facebook. And Rob has actually been in this space in many different guises for most of his career. We have Kutsia Boutel, who is here as the TUC's head of equalities and strategy. She told me before this call that she always feels about herself that she's a teacher first and foremost, but she has been in this role for a while and has looked at things such as Ofsted and improvement of pay and conditions for teachers. We have Sarah Morris, who's the Group Chief People Officer for the massive food service Compass Group, which works all over the world. And she'll be giving her views on what's happening with people on the front lines. And as I mentioned, we're opening with Jenny Hill, who's actually the MD of Strategy and Proposition at Carrion and Box. And Jenny has worked for over 10 years with some of the top companies that work with her consultancy, engaged in the programs of cultural change with them. So Jenny, I'd love to hand over to you to hear some of the results of your survey. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anne. Yes, and thanks to the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for partnering with us on this research, which we're really pleased to share with you today. So we'll start by hoping that the Zoom gods are being kind today and that I can share my screen with you. I'm looking to the panel. Is that shared? Can everyone see? Perfect, yes. Good start. So as Anne said, this research is based on the views of over 250 organisations of different sizes and from different sectors, because the decisions that they make now are going to impact how inclusive our workplaces are in the future. Now, we do focus on parents and carers in particular at parts of this research, picking up on a piece of work we did 6 months ago, looking at the effect on this group during the pandemic. And it's a subject that's quite close to home for me as one of the many working mothers who returned from maternity leave into a pandemic and into a totally new way of working. I think you'll see as we go through the research that actually the themes are universal and kind of go beyond that group and have broad implications for the broader workforce and the broader workplaces. So for the next 10 minutes, I'd like to just talk to you about 4 of the key main findings from this research, and then to end with the 3 areas that it suggests that organisations need to focus on as they're thinking about, as a lot of us are, around kind of grappling the changes, what the transition is going to look like and what the future of work will be. So before I share the 4 key themes, I'd just like to acknowledge the complexity at play here. So much has been written about the pandemic and its effect on every aspect of our lives. And I think the one thing that's certain is that the experience hasn't been universal. And that's not just for individuals, but it's also for organisations. So we asked organisations what the impact has been on their organisational performance. And you can see from the top chart that it's a really varied picture, from those on the left-hand side who've perhaps been hit hardest and have really struggled and in many cases are fighting to survive and adapt, to those on the right-hand side who may have benefited from increased demand, new demands or successful adaptations. And this obviously will be having an effect on how it feels to an extent to work in those organisations and the level of morale. So the second chart there shows you, we asked organisations to observe whether they thought that morale was better or worse compared to this time 6 months ago. And again, you see quite a mixed picture there. But the reason that we share this is because this is the mood music and some of the context for organisations as their leaders are looking to make decisions about the future and what's possible and what's going to work, and balancing those kind of business and individual needs. So the impact is varied, that we know, but there's actually some really clear common themes that are shared across organisations that I'd just like to talk through now. So it starts with actually a great sense of optimism about the future, and 82% of those surveyed said that they were really positive that there would be some lasting positive impacts on the way that we work as a result of the pandemic. So you'll see that this is mainly around working from home and flexible working, and the unimaginable reality pre-pandemic that some roles and kind of more knowledge workers and office space, that some of those roles could be done from home without having drastic impacts on productivity, opens up new possibilities for potentially what the future of work could be. This, along with improvements in tools, technology, and less travel, have been some of the silver linings that organisations have observed from a really difficult experience. Now, of course, the choice to be able to choose where you work from, whether that's from home, an office, or remote, is a privilege not afforded to the majority of roles within the workforce, and we acknowledge that. But it is interesting that of those surveyed, the majority of organisations are anticipating that hybrid working will become the norm for those who can. And many of these organisations may have been offering this before, may have been offering a degree of home working. I think for a lot of organisations, this is about shifting from, people being lucky to work from home on a Friday to people having a much more meaningful and official split between work, office-based and home. And you see from the research there that, over half are imagining there'll be this sort of 50-50 split. And this is great to a certain extent. There's some, if applied in the right way, there's some opportunities to really use a hybrid model to improve inclusivity for certain groups. But there's a bit of a watch out in this research that we don't focus too much on location and that we don't get distracted, because it's about more than where you work, it's about how we work as well. And we see from the research that there's huge increases in support for home working in particular as a result of the pandemic, and for flexible hours, part-time working, and parents and carers, though to a lesser extent. And what's interesting is when we looked at the qualitative research around this, so we did some interviews and also there were open text questions on the survey, we found two main things that I'd just like to talk about. Firstly, there's a way to go in terms of attitudes around flexible working and part-time working. So I think, there's been a shift in mindset around location for some roles, but in terms of how we do them, less so. And secondly, the always on culture that's been created for many around home working has been a real challenge. So whilst there's flexibility around location, there's actually been a collapse of that sort of 9 to 5 and the structure of people being, for those who are office based, a little bit more structure to their day. So actually it can become a bit more limitless, a bit more blurred, and there is this kind of intensification of this always on culture. And we know that, and particularly as this research was conducted just before schools returned in the last pandemic, that we know for parents and carers over the last year, this notion of always on is intensified further still, as many have been balancing homeschooling with their day jobs, as it were. And this idea of double shifting has, really been a challenge for parents and carers to manage. And this might be one of the reasons why we continue to see parents and carers having paid the price for the pandemic. And when we say that, what we mean is having to choose to use annual leave, reduce their working hours, or take unpaid leave, just to balance the realities of their work and their responsibilities. And this touches on the really powerful research that the TUC did on working mums paying the price for the pandemic, which I'm sure Kudsia will share in a bit more detail later. But there's, this is something that we looked at 6 months ago in the initial research, and we haven't seen it evolve, unfortunately, and parents and carers continue to pay the price. We see a similar story around career costs, which is explored a bit more in the detailed report. And it's worth noting that I think one of the reasons around this research suggests is that the policy provision continues to be quite inconsistent and ad hoc, which makes it quite difficult. And even when policies were in place, the research found that perceptions of workload or the awareness and understanding of line managers and leaders to implement those policies were acting as blockers for people being able to make use of them, so that they didn't have to resort to using annual leave or even worse, sort of reducing hours or removing themselves from the workforce. So one point on the policies where we're seeing a particular challenge is around the redundancy and restructure. So we saw at the beginning that the pandemic has had a really significant impact for some organisations on performance, and there's lots of implications for that, lots of kind of strategy reshaping and looking at how organisations adapt and evolve. So it's perhaps unsurprising that 37% are saying that they're currently planning to make redundancies in the next year. Now, when we asked around policies to mitigate against redundancy selection, where absence had been affected by the pandemic because of caring responsibilities, we saw that it was only the minority that answered positively around this. And there isn't that kind of real strong focus on this consistently across organisations, which undoubtedly is adding a level of anxiety and uncertainty. So if there are sort of 4 of the key findings of the common themes across organisation, now let's look at the 3 areas that the research suggests organisations should focus on as they look to the future and look to help people through this transition. Given what we've just spoken about, and given the sort of the human challenge, human crisis, human cost of the pandemic, I think it makes sense that we start with mental well-being. Now, a lot of the sort of mental wellbeing challenges at work predate the pandemic, but they have been intensified for many groups, particularly there's lots of research around the impact for working mothers. And whether it's kind of burnout, exhaustion, anxiety, fatigue, the whole spectrum of challenges that are significant. And what was really surprising in this research is only actually a fairly low proportion, so 55%, said that their organisations were putting plans in place to support mental well-being as people return to work. And I think when we dug a bit deeper into this, there was quite a focus on, webinars, tools, resources, all really important and all part of the picture, but there was less focus on that kind of strategy, policy and culture. And I think that's something that is so important for organisations to have front of mind for the transition back to office spaces for those who are, but also the broader picture and the broader plans for the future of work and how we design work for people. The second area of focus, I think, is probably contributing to this sense of anxiety and uncertainty, and that's the lack of clear vision for the future of what the future of work will be, what the situation is. And we saw in the research that only 30% said they felt that there was a really clear consensus and really clear vision that's been shared. Now, we know from our broader research with organisations across multiple sectors, geographies over the last 15 years, that tone from the top and that really clear direction is a key driver of employee engagement and experience and positive culture. So we know that this is really important. And we also know that it's been really difficult for organisations to provide that in such uncertain times, particularly those who are multinational, who are balancing, different regulations, different lockdown restrictions, different vaccine rollouts. It's a complex picture. But what we do see is that for those who where there has been a clear vision shared, morale is significantly higher. And for those, the 23% there who said it varies by individual leader, these organisations are also much less positive about key metrics such as well-being, involvement, policy provision. So there's a real need, I think, and an opportunity to whether, even if it's a segmented or a transitional plan, to be really clear about what the future looks like. And then finally, if we come back to that optimism that we talked about at the beginning, and this sense that, you know, that organisations are anticipating that those who can work in this hybrid way, and the possibilities and the excitement around this of what this could be, compared to if someone had said that to you, you know, 17 months ago, which it would have felt just not possible. But what's interesting is that only 36% of organisations said they're planning to redesign roles for a remote or hybrid working environment. Now, you might say, well, it's worked for the past 12, 13 months. Why do we need to redesign roles? Why do we need to look at it? But I think there's just a few things to note there around to consider as organisations are looking at this. Firstly, if we go to the mental well-being aspect and lens, there's a real question on sustainability here, and on whether the way that we've worked through crisis is sustainable for the medium to long term. Secondly, there's perhaps a missed opportunity if we don't use this opportunity, this moment of shift and flux around what's happening and where things are going. If we don't use that, not just to tackle things that have come out of the pandemic, but to look at those that predate the pandemic, some challenges around, you know, toxic work cultures, inclusivity of work, this always on notion, which, you know, didn't start in March 2020. That's been something that we, you know, we've been grappling with for a while. And then finally, I think there's two final things in there. If we are in a situation where there is choice, and I think that part of the benefit of hybrid working is it offers that choice and that individuality for people to make work for them. But if we do offer that choice, there's some unintended consequences potentially of what that could mean. So, for example, it may be likely that those who choose to work from home for greater flexibility may also be those with caring responsibilities. And we already see a two-tier workforce around kind of full-time and part-time workers in offices and in work environments. And I think there's a consideration there about how we manage that and make sure we don't further entrench that. And then finally, on a really practical note, I mean, how many of us have been in that really, you know, the situation where you dial into a meeting and some people are in the room, some people are on video, some people are on the line. It's really, you know, it's not necessarily the best and most conducive environment for you to work through things. And I think there's a sense of, for those who have been fully remote, or whether it's teams or functions within organisations who've been fully remote, it's about to get a bit messier once we go to hybrid and we've got different people in different days in the offices and different places. And, you know, that matters. That's going to have a really big effect on experience, on how it feels, and an ability to get work done. So I think there's a really practical point there around, you know, just thinking what this is actually going to look like and trying to overcome some of those challenges. So before I hand back to Anne, I guess just to conclude, and really looking forward to discussing with the panel, but there's a definite opportunity for this to be about more than location, and for it to be about how an organisation embrace flexibility to design more inclusive workplaces and workplace cultures, whether they're virtual or physical. And I think it's just about that need for us to look at the how we're working as well as where we're working, so that we don't get distracted by buzzwords like hybrid working, for example. So great, I'll hand back to Anne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Absolutely fascinating, and so many things there you just said that I absolutely see in the working environment. I've just been in a board meeting for the last 2 days where some people have been in the office, joining in a group in the office. Other people have been sitting in their own homes. There have been about 30 people on Zoom at the same time. You can't see everyone. And it's a really difficult environment. So that definitely needs to be thought about. And I love your statistic that 97% of companies are thinking of being hybrid, but only 36% are actually thinking of redefining the roles. That's really fascinating. Also, the fact that you've got the redundancy selection. Worry going on. If 37% of firms are saying we will have some redundancies, then are those people who have been homeschooling, caring for their elderly, are they going to be more at risk? And seeing your own employees actually take annual leave to help themselves with this situation. So with that note, I'd love to move over to Kutsia, who's going to sort of drill down a little bit on the whole parental and caring side of the equation, the financial cost on that segment, but also what does the future hold? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Anne. I've successfully got myself off mute, so it's already a winner. Jenny, that was so interesting, and it was really interesting to hear the CEC research reference there, because I think this is one of those rare occasions where everybody is in the same place about how we move forward out of the pandemic. But I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the pandemic. So one of the things that's happened is that COVID-19 has blown, I think, the covers off structural and systemic inequalities that exist. You mentioned the things that existed long before March 2020, and I think there are a whole bunch of people across the country saying, well, we knew, you know, this is no different for us, or it's just worse for us, but the systems that hold us back have always been there. And I think COVID-19 has exposed those and given us the opportunity to address those together. But what it did do was hit working class families the hardest and working class communities the hardest. And the worst effects of all of that has been borne by women. And one of the biggest impact around that has been caring responsibilities and the impact that, and the dual role that women hold. And make no mistake about it, the decisions made to move to remote learning for primary and secondary age children twice hit women massively. And these were women that were just coming out of it from having done it the first time around. And when I say hit, I mean financially, socially, emotionally, and in terms of their career prospects. Because we know that over a third of working households were affected by this, to the point where it was a record scratch, everything had to stop, and complete new ways of living had to be explored. But we know that the burden for juggling work and care fell predominantly on women, as it has done each time. And, you know, even the Chancellor famously, somewhat patronisingly referenced this about women doing their job. And we did a survey on this not too long ago at the beginning of January. And that's fine, we do surveys, we do research all the time. And what was really interesting was that we got 55,000 respondents. What was more interesting was we got 50-odd thousand of those respondents within a couple of hours of our survey going live. Such was the strength of feeling of women and carers wanting to say, somebody needs to hear what this pandemic has done to us, what the impact on the way that we work and the way that we live has been. And we found that the impact fell on well-being, on income and job security, three things that are central to anybody women were bearing the brunt of, and seemingly without any kind of way of moving forward. We asked questions around furlough, and absolutely staggeringly 7 out of 10 requests for furlough for working mums were turned down, especially when requests for furlough for caring could be made. And you know, it was an avenue that was presented that wasn't used, and that meant working mums, carers had to find an alternative. And the alternatives were using annual leave, reducing your paid for hours, even though the work still had to be done, or the impossible task of homeschooling children, caring for children, and working full time, and not understanding the tipping point that is going to come with that. 90% of our mums and carers that responded said that there had been a significant negative mental health impact on them, and stress and anxiety were at the forefront of every decision, and seemingly no way out. And with no system of paid parental leave, lack of flexible work opportunities for much of the workforce, it was a real impossible situation, with many parents either risking losing their job or being forced to leave their jobs, or the other, and being faced with the catastrophic loss of income. You know, situations that nobody wants. Parents were being thrust upon them with 0 hours notice. And I just wanted, before I'm fast running out of time to talk about this all day, but I want to mention so many parents use their annual leave to manage this. So many parents ran that annual leave entitlement down by the end of January. So you are facing the entire of your annual leave year with no respite from the burden of full-time work or part-time work and caring responsibilities, and the impact of that on the country, on parents and carers as a workforce is absolutely potentially catastrophic. And the other option being unpaid leave, but we know that the increase in food banks has been used, and we know that statutory sick pay doesn't meet what we need it to meet, to be at a living amount. So we're facing a real situation where we've got to come out of the pandemic in a structured way that supports those that have been hit the absolute worst by this. And one thing I'm going to say before I do run out of time is, Jenny, you mentioned not just hours of work and ways of work, and I think that's absolutely right, because the expectation of jobs being carried out as normal whilst balancing childcare, whilst balancing homeschooling, is untenable. It can't be done. And I think we have to look at how we manage our expectations of those with a do what you can in the time you have attitude, and move that to a do the work when you can, and swap those things around. You know, it can't be, oh, you've got a couple of hours spare, can you fit your job in? We have to change the tasks that we're asked to do and the expectations we have of them. And I'm going to leave you on a little anecdote. I mentioned to the panel earlier that I'm a teacher. I taught for 20 years. I was a head teacher for the last part of my career. And I taught the same age of children that my son is now. And we had 6 weeks together homeschooling. And by the end of that, I was more exhausted, more weary, and more traumatized than at any other point in my working and parental life. And I think we need to recognize that and the impact that that has on the workforce more generally. And I say that as someone who was privileged enough to be able to work at home and have flexible options. And I think it can't be understated how much parents have been asked to give, working parents have been asked to give and continue to give without being remunerated appropriately. You know, the public sector pay freeze has affected working parents significantly, and recognising that parents are predominantly, and working mums are predominantly on the front line. They are doing those jobs that are keeping this country going, and we need to think about how we support them now and beyond.
Thanks very much, Kutsia. I mean, I think I'm sure that everything that you said, has been picked up by people on the call, and there'll be people that we can't see that are nodding about the experience and the passion with which you're projecting it. I mean, that statistic about 7 out of 10, mums who requested furlough being turned down is absolutely astounding. And, I want to sort of continue on this vein of people and move to Sarah, because Sarah, in her role as head of HR for Compass, she is running a company from the people perspective that is all over the world. So she's not just seeing what's happening here in Britain, but she's seeing what's happening from Australia to Latin America. And Sarah, what are you actually seeing during the pandemic? What's the impact on people who are working through it? What's the impact of furlough? Because often, in the tech world, we get very sort of involved in our own view of, oh, we can do this digitally and we're all working remotely from home and that's cool. But actually, huge swathes of the population are not like that at all.
No, thanks very much, Anne. I have to say a lot of what I heard Kutsia talk about just really hit home for us, because our workforce is a frontline workforce predominantly. I mean, we have pre-pandemic close to 600,000 colleagues around the world, and about 80% of those are on the front line. So there is no such thing as flexible working, not going into an office or choosing to do your work from somewhere else for the vast majority of my colleagues. And if I just talk about the UK alone, we've got 30,000 colleagues who are on the front line in hospitals and healthcare, and have been right through the pandemic and really have done the most incredible job. We've got close to 12,000 frontline people who have kept schools running for essential key workers. Just in the UK, that number is close to 200,000 around the world. So I think for us, it's been a really different challenge to work through. We do have all of the challenges we heard Jenny talk about with our office workers, but that's a few hundred for us. The really important impact and the way where we've been focused has been how can we reduce the impact on our frontline workforce. we operate in some challenging environments. We operate, as I say, in schools, in frontline healthcare, in offshore environments, in many military environments. And throughout the pandemic, I think what we've seen is a couple of really important shifts that I hope we can, across this industry, keep some of the learnings from. I think the first one has been a revaluing of those jobs, a revaluing of those roles by society. And I really think we have to work hard not to lose that. So never has it been more important to have a friendly face if your child is turning up to school and wants to have a hot meal served. Never has it been more important to make sure that cleaners in hospitals are doing great work. And for many of those people, they are working parents, men and women. We actually have an industry and a workforce that is pretty gender balanced. So for us, it's not so much about men and women, but it's much more about recognising the challenges for working parents. And one of those opportunities is around flexibility. So we've put in place some things in the UK. There's something called Constellation, which enables our colleagues to choose much more proactively the hours that work for them. One of the things we've learned is that you shouldn't judge other people's circumstances, and what works for one set of colleagues might not work for another. So by enabling them to choose their flexibility, they've been able to avoid some of the things we've just heard talked about, where they've had to make awfully stark choices between annual leave, between taking unpaid leave. Allowing that flexibility is really important. We've also seen the value of safety in the workplace and well-being shoot up the value proposition. So we've focused heavily on that all around the world. We've done lots of work, as you say, in Australia on mental well-being. We've done lots of work in the US we were the only large US employer to maintain colleague healthcare benefits when they were put on furlough. Nobody else in the US does that. And any of you with US businesses will understand the very significant cost to do that, but the importance for our colleagues to know that they still had access to well-being and healthcare during a difficult time. So I think the value proposition has shifted. We've seen that shift. We really believe that we can refocus career opportunities. We are barrierless to entry. So we mentioned, I think, intersectionality earlier on. For us, that means we are barrierless to entry and we can provide real careers in social hotspots all around the world. This is an organisation where somebody can come in, they can join as an apprentice, and they can finish as an executive chef of some of the most prestigious Michelin-starred places in the world, because we also run those, by the way. Won't it be lovely when we can get back to some of those places? So I think for us to be able to operate that barrierless entry feels to us like an opportunity coming through COVID. And I just hope we can keep some of the pride in perhaps career paths and jobs that haven't always been looked at as being so worthwhile and that haven't always been thought of as being such an important part of society's fabric around the world. Because for us, we've got hundreds of thousands of colleagues out there doing this every single day, the best they can, and we really need to help them to feel valued. I could talk about it, Anne, all day. Perhaps we'll talk about the living wage later on, because I think that's a really important thing, and I knew I'd get a thumbs up. We've got a lot of work to do there, and we're proud to be a real living wage employer, but enough of that for now.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And I'm laughing about the Michelin star thing, because last night I actually went out to the pub for dinner in the northeast, which was -3 degrees, I have to say. But it was the most wonderful experience, and we went out and sat with a couple of other members of our family, and had a marvelous evening. Actually, so happy. Okay, with that note, I'd like to move across to Rob now, because we've heard a little bit, well, a lot actually, about what's happening with parents and carers. We've heard Sarah talking about, the front line, keeping everything going, and many of the things that her company are putting into practice. But let's think now about the actual working environment. I mean, 97% of people responding, saying that companies saying they're going to work in a hybrid way, but what are they doing to redesign their workplaces? What are they actually thinking about?
Yeah, thanks very much, Anna. And just like Sarah, I would just say, in my role as well, we have lots of companies like Sarah that support our facilities and environments, and also lots of our people as well that are on the front line and in the offices supporting essential work around the world throughout COVID. And I think the appreciation of those jobs and that work has actually dramatically increased. So that has been a positive from that perspective in the last sort of 12 to 15 months. But just to come back in terms of the way that we design and operate our spaces is really to be fully inclusive, and so that they're welcoming and they're accessible to everybody. And so in thinking of designing and redesigning workplaces for hybrid working, it's essential, in my view, that inclusion is at the heart of design. We announced in May last year a long-term commitment to remote working, and so over time we'll see more of our employees working remotely, because pre-COVID, pretty well everybody at Facebook came into the office and had a desk in the office. And so I'm personally, like Jenny mentioned, I'm really excited about the increase of hybrid work, because it has so much potential to allow access to both new diverse talent pools, and also offer more choice so as to where people can live and work, so we can kind of further grow and diversify the workforce. But the workplace, as we talked about, it needs to adapt to support remote and flex workers and to ensure that they aren't disadvantaged. And so, how the workplace changes specifically will vary on the particular program, hybrid work program, whatever the company or organization, in case in point, decides to adopt. But some important focus areas from my perspective. And I think the first is that, as part of this, whether you're a remote worker or flex worker, the home working environment is going to be, for office-based workers, those flex workers, the home office working environment is going to be more significant. And so offering formal support for people in home office environments, so that they're optimally set up, and they're also, where possible, have the same standard as in-office workers, and that includes things like equipment, so furniture, technology, and ergonomic equipment, services, so clearly things like access to high-speed internet, but also I think importantly advice as well, things like what is the optimal setup from if you're doing VC, or what is your optimal ergo setup, and even simple well-being aspects and safety aspects. But simple things like the type of plants that you have in your home office environment, which plants absorb more oxygen, give you, or more CO2, and give you a kind of healthier environment. Even simple things like that, I think, can help. And so actually at Facebook, we provide both advice and a kind of equipment allowance to home office workers. And I think, there will obviously be times where the home office environment is challenged, but people aren't going to go into the formal office, and so maybe providing easy access to a third space, whether that's a co-working space or flex offices, so there's an alternative close by. And I think that's particularly important for, say, for parents or people with care responsibilities, so that they have that availability close by. And so then if we come into the actual in-office environments, I think they obviously need to provide a great experience for remote and for flex workers. So it's as easy for them coming into the office to get their work done as it is for the 100% or the full in-office based workers. And so we really need to think carefully about what is the journey and the experience that the remote and flex worker is going to have when they come into the office, and how does the office need to support them? Just simple things like access to IT support, or getting basic services, that's going to be really important, and how they interact with their teams. And I think the office needs to support ease of connectivity to flex and remote workers. That was mentioned in the research, is that we're now, a lot of people are either remote at the moment, and they will come into this much more hybrid environment. And so making sure that flex and remote workers who aren't in the office are fully included, in particular in kind of formal and informal meeting spaces, easy access for VC in the office, so that you can, it's really easy to facilitate formal and ad hoc connection between in-office workers and remote and flex workers. And obviously technology, both in the office and outside, plays a huge role as an enabler for that. And I think, they also, depending on what type of hybrid program a company adopts, the in-office environment needs to support the change of the work of the activities that are being taken in the office. So, you know, if companies are really going to very much a kind of remote model, then, you know, maybe you're using the office for different purposes than you have done in the past, perhaps more collaboration. And so, you know, the actual design of the office will need to support that. And I think the other important thing is it's not just about the workplace either, but I think also leader behaviors need to support these changes. And that's something that we're investing heavily in. But I think, you know, from my perspective, leaders will, you know, have needed, and they will continue even more so to have to be inclusive and mindful of remote and flex workers, and things like, you know, showing care and empathy and understanding of and creating that environment in their wider teams, and communicating well and sharing context, you know, human connection, building community in their teams, collaborating well, and being actually just simply being generous with time. I think these are leadership traits and behaviors that managers are going to be expected to show more of, and it's something certainly that we're promoting at Facebook. And actually, many of these leadership traits are traits that actually women tend to exhibit more than men, and I think it's going to be undoubtedly traits that will be required increasingly in the future as we manage in this hybrid environment.
Thanks very much, Rob. And you know, it's interesting because a question had come in from Hinde Elenwawi about, you know, what can we do to improve working environments for those who can't work effectively from home due to space, due to perhaps bad things like physical abuse and so on. And you did mention that, you know, you were looking at co-workers that, you know, could work close by to each other. I've heard this said before, but, you know, my question is anyone actually doing that? You know, it's a great concept, but are any office spaces being hired to say, you know, you can go work close by to home? Or is this just very conceptual? And maybe Jenny, I don't know whether your research or could see, you know, anyone on the call, does anyone know of action that's been taken in this area?
I think from, you know, there's certainly a lot of, you know, what I was referring to is the kind of a third space, or a kind of a co-working space. So, you know, there are sort of big companies globally that provide that kind of office space, you know, whether it's sort of, you know, WeWork or IWG, or there's a range of others. And I think what hopefully we'll see as well, we've also seen during, you know, some hotel chains, for example, in the US and elsewhere have actually made hotels, you know, sort of part-time, or kind of, you know, be able to hire hotel rooms as working space on a short-term basis. So I think there's a lot of thought being put into that area, and I think we'll probably see more types of space hopefully emerging, and I think also being able to easily book it. There is quite a lot of technology platforms that are emerging that enable you to easily book that type of space on a very, you know, short-term basis, which I think will also help make those types of spaces more accessible as well.
Yeah, and I think just to add, I think a lot of organisations have made office spaces available for those who have needed it, but I think that definition of need has been difficult in some cases. So I know the question mentioned around, you know, where there's perhaps a safety issue at home, and I think, or a mental health issue, and I think lots of organisations, both from the research but also from that we work with, are making those spaces possible. I think the extent of the wellbeing challenge, and if we think particularly perhaps of at the younger end of the workforce of you know, and it not exclusively that group, but perhaps at start of careers in it, you know, working from bedrooms, working from shared you know, shared flats or houses, you know, that's a really difficult, in terms of the sustainability point we mentioned earlier about how long you can work like that, that's, you know, there's really big questions there. So I think it's been a spectrum, and I know that organisations have looked at that where there's been a particular need, but actually I think a lot of people can't work from home productively in a way that supports their mental well-being for an indefinite period of time. So there will as part of the transition, I think that as the decisions around hybrid for office-based and knowledge workers, there's going to need to be a real look at what proportion and how that works and how that works in practice. I think that one of the survey respondents talked about that need now for action and to turn kind of rhetoric into reality. And I think that's one of the key areas that are going to need to be addressed quite quickly over the coming months.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because here in Britain, we had a lot of discussion about the levelling up agenda. And in the past, you know, if you were living in, say, the north, it was a lot harder to get promoted, move up the ladder. You know, you were not in the same situation as somebody living down to London. That's why many of us, you know, left our homes and migrated to London so that we could become, you know, more successful in our careers. And I suppose the question for us in the future, and someone has posed this, Simon Marquis, is, you know, what do you think firms are going to need to do to mitigate the proximity bias when it comes to promotion and talent and identification and development if, you know, we go to this hybrid working? I don't know whether anybody's got any thoughts on that. I think
yeah, I was just going to say, I think Rob touched on this really well at the end of what he was saying, which is it's not about what we do, it's about how we lead that and what our expectations are and how leaders lead that and what the ultimate goal is. And I think that has to be it. I think this one size fits all isn't going to work. I think hybrid working as a title has got to have so many different aspects to it that address so many issues. I know certainly from our perspective, home working has become synonymous with flexible working, and you know, and home working is actually a huge luxury for a select number of jobs and a select number of contexts, with lots of other factors that people endure daily being taken away. And I think we have to recognize that real flexibility and real hybrid working has to take account of the jobs that people do and the expectations that are made of them. And it has to go beyond that into the salaries that they're paid and the career progression that they're allowed to have and form part of an overall package, because those are the factors that will really give us a flexible hybrid working model moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone else has just asked a question about, Claire Campion's asked, you know, what are your companies and organizations doing in respect of parents and carer networks, and how have they evolved actually during the last year? I mean, are they more successful, less successful, doing anything different? Anyone want to take that question? And Sarah?
I have to say, I'm not sure they've necessarily evolved too much, but something we have done in the last, in fact, started 4 weeks ago, is we've stood up a series of webinars which have focused on topics which we know from talking to our colleagues are shared areas of challenge for working parents, mums, dads, and anyone else with child caring or caring responsibilities, actually. And so the first couple have been around the mental well-being aspect of homeschooling, because we've had lots and lots of colleagues talking to us about their concerns and their fears about how to best support their children who are returning. While it's easy to say everybody's delighted and was laying on the floor drinking wine at 11 o'clock on the first day schools were open, actually the lived experience for some children was challenging. And so how do we help parents with that? So we engaged a couple of psychologists who put something on for us. The next one is on financial well-being. We know that in some situations people have had to overextend themselves and potentially to borrow against more challenging circumstances. So we've done some around financial well-being. And then the next one is going to be on returning to physical health, because we also know we've got people who have had to trade exercise for homeschooling, who have had to make different dietary choices. And so how do we help people to take back control of that? So that's come about through the network. I'm not sure the network itself has really changed, but maybe a difference in the recognition of the support that they've appreciated, I think.
Interesting. Someone's actually asked you, Sarah, Janet Hayes has asked, could you just explain a little bit more about barrierless entry?
Yes, of course. So barrierless entry for us simply means you can join us and you are judged on merit. So you don't need formal qualifications. Now, of course, not all roles are created equally. If you want to join and be an executive chef in the place Anne went for dinner last night, then you need to have existing experience. But if you'd like to join on one of our apprentice programs, and apprenticeships are really, really important. We are an apprenticeship organisation. You can join us with little to no qualifications and learn as you go, and you genuinely can progress all the way through the organisation. So we talk about that as being barrierless to your social background, barrierless to your education, barrierless to what your parents did, who they went to school with. We really are an organisation, and we focus quite hard in the first few months on helping people to get to a level playing field in some of those aspects. If you've read anything, and everybody will have done on this panel, I'm sure, around social mobility challenges, there's nothing worse than listening to a young person speak about the first time that they've had to go to a dinner and not understood where the cutlery should sit and why people are talking about their wine cells and all these awful phrases that you pick up. That's not the environment of the organisation we operate. We really are a barrierless organisation, and I think pretty proud of that apprentice culture.
That's really interesting. Apprenticeship being a huge thing again in the country that we want to encourage and revive, I know, across the whole country. There's a question here from Joanna Lumlin about, the fact that the big firms in the city are actually deciding how much time to ask their employees to come into the office, being very prescriptive about it. And her question is, should that be the way that companies go, or, should they think about being more flexible? I mean, what's the pros and cons, really?
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting on that, because I think one of the things there is this idea of choice, which I think is important for inclusion and allowing people to make choices that work for them. But there's also the reality check, I guess, for businesses, if they need to have an understanding of, okay, well, how, just from a practical perspective, how many people are we going to be having in offices? What does that mean? I think there's a real need to be realistic of, yes, this needs to be more individualistic than we were before, and there needs to be choice. But we also, as we saw at the beginning around the impact on business performance, we need to be aware of the realities that organisations are making these decisions in, and some of the, the cost implications, which shouldn't lead these decisions, but they are part of them, and we do need to be realistic about that. So I think if there's a way, and I know quite a few organisations, I think BP came out and said that post-pandemic, people could work from home 2 days a week for those who are in roles that's possible. And I guess that gives people that understanding that that's what's coming and that's what's going to be the option, but also the understanding from an organisational perspective of the expectation of how much people are going to be in the office and what that means for some of the decisions they need to make.
Absolutely. Could see how you wanted to make a point on that.
And just to really compliment what Jenny was saying, in that I think for us, it's less about specifying days or particular days of the week, but what I would really welcome is if employers were to conduct equalities impact assessments and to see how decisions would impact the people that work in those organisations, because then I think it would lead to a more meaningful conversation between those that make the decisions, those that then do the work, and how we, bridge those gaps, and to make sure that no one group is discriminated against, or a decision that's implemented in goodwill, like we're going to work 2 days a week, doesn't actually end up being a bad decision that is not good for the productivity of an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that. And, it's quite interesting because some firms have been separating into A and B teams and so on in their working environment. And sometimes a whole team needs to sit together. And so it's not obvious how you should do things. And I'm sure Rob's thinking about, what is the spatial footprint of the business, depending on which way that you work. And on that point, we've got like 6 minutes left. So I'd like to quickly whip around the panel and say, what's the one parting thought that you would give to people who've been listening to this discussion today? Rob, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, as for me, it's sort of, from a kind of a physical workspace perspective, it's like, what is the future work program that your company is going to adopt, and how will the workplace best support that program, especially from an inclusivity perspective, and and have inclusion for hybrid work at the heart of the design of that. And I think we've seen rapid change, and we've seen lasting change. But I think also I think it's still important to be flexible, because there's potentially more to come. And I think one of the things that we're certainly going to do is to be really prepared to observe behaviours. How are people behaving when they're either coming back into the office, or as remote and hybrid work develops. And then I think also this is obviously a great opportunity to pilot new things as well. So those are some of the my parting thoughts.
Sarah, over to you for your parting.
It's picking up on something Kudsia said, because we belong to something called the Women in Hospitality, Travel and Leisure, and there'll be other people listening who I'm sure do. We have about 2.6 million members. And very sadly, in a piece of research that's just been done, only 15% of organisations considered their policy decision impacts on women or those with ethnic minority backgrounds. I think my advice would be, please go away and look at the decisions you're making on those groups who are in minorities, because without doing that, you are really, I think, leading into the future with a great deal of uncertainty for minority groups, whether it is women, whether it is ethnic minorities, whether it is for your disabled colleagues. Please go away and think about the unintended consequences, because it's very easy to make these policy decisions without realising and appreciating the impact, the unintended impact it can have on those colleagues.
Absolutely. Kudsia?
Thanks, Anne. I have so many things that I'd like to be done, but my top hitters are around the fact that I think in this particular field we need to look at make sure things like gender pay gap monitoring don't fall by the wayside like they did this last year, and that just why what was the story that wasn't being told by that. But I think we need to take this opportunity to address some of the barriers that have been uncovered and make sure they don't happen again. Things like better parental leave, better starting salaries, better pay progression, and better job opportunities for those people that are doing those jobs for women. And also, let's look at those things that really do compound structural inequality, like maternity breaks, what happens there, like carer responsibilities. How can we make sure we mitigate against those? And I think what Sarah was saying around a suite of equality impact assessed policies is the way to do that. I don't believe that anybody would willfully want to discriminate against any one particular group of worker, but what we need is employers to put their money where their mouth is and to undertake those tasks that show that they're taking action to make sure that doesn't happen.
Absolutely, it's the practical actions. And by the way, there's been a lot of questions on the Q&A about what are the practical things that you can do, and I think that all of the panel have been giving us some really practical examples of what happens inside different companies and what should be happening to address the future. And Jenny, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Great, I'll make the most of it. I guess I think the inclusivity point is key, but to build on that practical point, I guess my final words on it would be to think big and to think small. Like, this absolutely has to be part of culture and strategy and policy, absolutely. But it's also going to be about what those, that kind of the day-to-day experience and what people see around them, which ultimately is what constitutes people's view of the culture. So I think really involving people in those sort of problem solving, those niggles or those little things that actually, as we move, whether it's a virtual, hybrid, physical, what is it that would make work more inclusive, better for people, help them feel better about their well-being, whatever it may be, and really involve people in looking at what matters most and what can be done around those. As well as looking at that bigger picture and the systemic challenges, because I think otherwise there's a danger that there's so many big topics and so many complicated aspects here to tackle, and it's getting that balance of getting a bit of energy and momentum around the day-to-day things that actually really matter to people and that make a really big difference. So I think, getting that balance of thinking big and thinking small concurrently is the advice that I would give in how we move forward.
Fantastic, Jenny. And I mean, I think your point on the lived experience is the thing that we've been talking about all during this panel. So it only remains for me to say that I'd like to thank the Policy Institute for supporting this, and Carrion and Box for their fantastic research. And thanks, of course, to our wonderful panel today, who've given us such a broad perspective from local to global of what we need to think about now and for the future. I believe that this event is recorded, so I'm sure people are going to look forward to watching some of it again online to get the nuggets of information and knowledge that have been shared this morning. And thanks to everyone.